Talk through some of those lessons is Shaun Harkin, who's a contributor to the International Socialist Review. He's also been an organizer in the anti-war movement, the immigrants' rights movement, and the labor movement. He has a lot to say.
Cool. Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, Mary kind of laid out what I was going to lay out, so maybe we can just go straight into discussion. She put it far more succinctly than I'm going to do. I just wanted to go through a few things about the impact, first of all, of 1968, which are kind of hard for us to believe right now. I mean, by the fall of 1968, public opinion polls said that 1 million students saw themselves as part of the left, that 368,000 people strongly agreed with the need for a mass revolutionary party. Among African Americans, especially those under 30, revolutionary sentiment basically became predominant. After 1968, I mean, 68 obviously was the beginning of something. Additional upheavals like Nixon's invasion of Colombia led to an explosion of anti-war activity on campuses throughout the US. A few months later, the New York Times reported that 4 out of 10 college students, which is nearly 3 million people at the time, thought a revolution was necessary in the United States. A 1970 survey showed that over 30% of black soldiers enlisted in Vietnam planned to join when they come back from Vietnam, planned to join a militant black group like the Black Panthers when they came back. In 1970, Business Week wrote this about what they were kind of worried about, and I'm sure people are familiar with Business Week. They said, the editorial said, the invasion of Cambodia and the senseless shooting of 4 students at Kent State University in Ohio have consolidated the academic community against the war, against business, and against government. This is a dangerous situation. It threatens the whole economic and social structure of the nation. So obviously they were a little bit worried about some of the ideas that some of the students and regular people were starting to develop about things that they were doing to them. And I think that this is, I mean, you know, obviously this is, you know, we're not used to the idea that revolutionary ideas have a mass audience. I mean, I think probably on this campus at RIC, we're competing with the meeting next week, which is what was the name of that meeting again we were looking at? The one about God. I don't want to offend anybody, but why, you know, what is the name of that meeting? Sorry, anyway, but people will see it, but there might be more people at that meeting next week, and that's the reality. We know that there's an audience, but it's not a mass audience. So it can be hard to figure out kind of why revolutionaries are a minority for most of the time, and why, you know, why is that the case? And yet, Tariq Ali, I don't know if people are familiar with Tariq Ali, but Tariq Ali is a Pakistani activist based in England, and he's written a number of books, Bush and Babylon, The Clash of Civilizations. He was a participant in 1968, unlike myself, and he said the year began like any other year. There was nothing to suggest the upheavals that were on the way. So in a sense, 1968, even for the participants, and hopefully there's some people here tonight who can talk more directly about that, came out of nowhere in a sense, and they were even surprised by what developed themselves. That was the student, you know, the actual revolutionary movement, which was quite small at the time. And there's been discussion about 68. I want to quote Tariq Ali again. He wrote an article about 3 or 4 weeks ago for The Guardian. It's a great article if you get to read it. And he said, this I think gives us a sense of like what 1968 was about. He says, a storm swept the world in 1968. It started in Vietnam, then blew across Asia, crossing the sea and the mountains to Europe and beyond. A brutal war waged by the US against a poor Southeast Asian country was seen every night on the television. The impact of watching the bombs drop, villages on fire, and a country being doused with napalm and Agent Orange triggered a wave of global revolts not seen on such a scale before or since. If the Vietnamese were defeating the world's most powerful state, surely we too could defeat our own rulers. That was the dominant mood among the more radical of the 1960s generation. And I think that does create a sense of like what was going on. It's kind of poetic and very well written. And so, you know, I think that, you know, for me, or maybe for other people as well, when you read or hear about 1968 and all the great stuff that happened, I get generation envy. I don't know if anybody else does. I mean, how many people in here were around in '68 and participated in some of this stuff? Brilliant. It's the first meeting I've been at where we've actually had veterans, so that's great. And you know, the good thing about '68 is that you get excited about any period of upheaval or any upheaval. Doesn't matter if it's 1 year or 20 years ago. But the thing about '68 was that it was major, and we have a connection to that generation of people. There's still a living link with you know, people who participated and were involved, and that's really important in terms of creating a new generation of radicals. Hopefully, we're going to see much bigger struggles, and we'll all be involved in that. And these kinds of discussions are part of shaping those, you know, shaping what's going to happen in the future. Obviously, this is the 40th anniversary, as Mary said, of 1968, and a lot has been written and said and done about '68 because there's been a 5th anniversary, a 10th anniversary, a 20th anniversary, a 30th anniversary, etc., etc. There's movies, there's songs, there's plays, and a lot of it's really useful. Some of it's nostalgic. You know, some of it's former radicals repenting and saying, we were good in the 1960s, we were, you know, young idealistic students, and then we became these violent prone nasties that just had, you know, doing things that were just crazy and so on and so forth. That was the radical component of the 60s and the 70s. And then there's also probably a big cottage industry in the academy that churns out lots of stuff all the time about analysing every aspect of 1968 that isn't really connected to any struggles happening today or happening in the future. So John Molyneux wrote this, and I think, you know, it's really right. And he wrote this in 1988, obviously, because the same discussions were happening back then. He says, and John Molyneux, for anybody that doesn't know him, is a British socialist. There's probably some books over there by him that are people should check out. And Molyneux wrote that here it is necessary to insist, in spite of and because of all the likely media hype, that 1968 is not a myth or a romantic fairy tale conjured up by aging hippies harking back to the good old days of their lost youth. On the contrary, it was a year of a real mass challenge to the international capitalist order on a scale that had not been seen since the end of the Second World War and possibly since the Great Revolutionary Wave of 1917 to 1923. So the point for us tonight's not really nostalgia, but that's totally fine if nostalgia is a good thing. What we want to try and do is connect our own radical history and then try to draw out some political lessons for the struggles of today and the struggles of the future. And I think, you know, obviously to change the future, we have to understand the past. That's crucial. And it was the Russian revolutionary Lenin who argued that the role of one of the things that a revolutionary organization has to do is to be the memory of the class. And what he meant by that was basically that, you know, some organization or something has to try and pass on lessons that have been learned by people who've struggled in the past, to pass them on to future generations of fighters who want to change the world, so we don't keep recreating the wheel. And I definitely wasn't somebody who believed in the importance of history. You know, when I was 15 in high school, I really thought that history was a disaster, and the best thing we could do was erase it or not teach people history. So I was a radical anti-history person. I mean, it seems really stupid right now, but I thought the way we're going to change the world is by having people not read about their history, because the history will only inflame all the old passions and make people hate each other and so on and so forth. So we had to kind of escape history. But that's what I thought then. I'm very much, I don't think that anymore, and I'm convinced that we have to know our history. And history is a battlefield, because throughout history there's been two sides. One side that wants to defend the status quo, the maintenance of the established order, and then another side that's fighting for liberation against oppression and fighting for a world that's fit for, you know, for human beings to live in. So ideas are really important. And, you know, it was Karl Marx, again, that wrote, you know, the ruling ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling class. And this might seem very, very obvious, but it's really important in the United States because, you know, we have, well, you know, the most ruthless, the most privileged, and the most powerful ruling class on the planet, or probably ever in history. And they've tried to systematically bury, you know, radical history in America. I mean, there's a tremendous radical history in America of like struggle for change, but the vast majority of people don't know anything about it. And it's not their own fault. It's because there's a campaign against it. And our rulers really, really hate '68 because it's the nearest period of upheaval and they still remember it. They hate everything that it stands for, so they want to distort it. and they want to annihilate all memory. And it really did rock the core of their system. So I think the starting point for us is that we want to defend 1968, the aspirations people had, the actions people took to try and change the world. And we want to learn something. I think we owe it to the generation of 68 to learn something from those struggles so we can apply them today. So just so that there, in terms of ideas, there's a battle about how to remember 1968. It's not just leftists that are putting forward their explanation. And I want to go through some of the competing explanations or histories that have been all over the mainstream press. I don't know if people have had access to these. But we'll start with a guy called Daniel Finkelstein. And he's the columnist for the Times of England. And he's the former advisor to John Major, who was the Prime Minister of England for quite a while. It was a disastrous period. He was with the Conservative Party. If anybody knows John Major, he was brought down by a tight scandal and prostitution and all that sort of stuff. I'm not going to do his English accent, his Oxbridge English accent, because I'm not very good at it, and I don't want to completely horrify everybody. But he says in his article, this was written in response to Tariq Ali, it is because I believe all attempts to explain 1968 in terms of ideas are doomed to failure. The events of 1968 were not about ideology, but demographics. Young people, particularly young men, tend to see violent solutions as the more acceptable than do other groups in society. In 1968, there was a bulge in the number of hot-headed young males. Yeah, and it gets better. This guy, with our blithe conviction that we can always make things better, we are convinced that political education and economic amelioration will work to bring peace where there is conflict. Educated and well-fed young males tend to greater violent unrest. The real lesson of the 1960s isn't turn on, tune in, drop out. It is press on, calm down and grow up. Now, this is like read by probably millions of people in England because, the rich control media. But young people don't start wars, drop nuclear bombs. This is just idiotic, and it passes for intellectual, discussion. Two, I just think that there's a kind of real, he's not talking about rich young men, he's talking about working class young men, you know what I mean? That they start fighting for change and they're too violent and so on and so forth. So I think there's a deep, deep class hatred and class arrogance that runs right through that article, and yet that is acceptable debate. So really disgusting. Especially in the day and age of Bush's wars all over the world, that he can kind of get away with writing this stuff. Then the next person is a guy called Robert Fulford, who writes for the National Post in Canada, which is a lot near, and he wrote an article called The Bogus Revolution. The National Post, if people don't know, is owned by Lord Conrad Black. Anybody familiar with him? Who's now serving time in Orlando, Florida, for stealing millions and millions of dollars and obstructing justice. Somebody who really lives by the rules and all that sort of stuff. This is what this guy writes. He says, 40 years ago this spring, when rebellious students ran wild across Western Europe, stopping France dead in its tracks, their mini-revolution had a bogus feeling. The high-spirited rhetoric seemed to me more fueled by hatred of parents and teachers than by plans for the future. Some 800,000 workers and students marched across Paris chanting, "De Gaulle assassin." Some perhaps recalling movies about 1789 actually ripped up cobblestones to throw at police. A national strike disrupted rail and air travel. So the first thing to say about this article maybe is that it actually does tell you something about what happened in 1968 in France, which isn't bad. That kind of captures something of the revolutionary moment. Two, falls back on the old tried and tested theory that anybody who complains or protests has something wrong with them. And that's why you are all here tonight, because this is your therapy, because you have serious problems. And Karl Marx wrote Capital because he had huge boils in his ass. And and so we all hate our parents, and that's the starting point. But it's hard to imagine when it's, and then we go to 1789. So, Robespierre, the Jacobins, Tom Paine, the American Revolution, all these people just hated their parents. And that's why we had all these revolutions and that, so on and so forth. So this is just completely ridiculous. So it's more about humour as well, obviously, that we're including these quotes. And then the last one is more serious, because this is a powerful guy right now, and it's Nicolas Sarkozy. And for people who don't know, Nicolas Sarkozy is the right-wing president of France. He's the political leader. They didn't do too well in the most recent elections, which is a good sign. But he is still the has political power in France. And he says May 1968 imposed intellectual and moral relativism on all of us. The heirs of May 68 imposed the idea that there was no longer any difference between good and evil, truth and falsehood, beauty and ugliness. The heritage of May 1968 introduced cynicism into society and politics. This is very odd because what he's really describing is neoliberalism. And I don't think that like the May generation had anything to do with like Enron, the world financial crisis that we're seeing right now, Northern Rock, corrupt politicians, deregulation, etc., the dictatorship of the free market. So I think he's got it back to front, and yet, he is responsible for much of this stuff. So it's outrageous and ridiculous. That's just to give people a sense of like the debate about 1968 goes on and continues, and it gives you a feel for, the different sides that people are taking around 68, and I think it matters which side you stand on. So the 1968, one of the most amazing things about it is its scale, because it really was an international revolt. It had a totally internationalist character, and I want to give people just a brief chronology of like some of the most important and key events. It's not all of them because the list is far, far too long. But to start with, there was the Tet Offensive, as Mary mentioned, and that was in January 1968. This was a massive uprising, and I'll talk more about that, later on. This was a massive uprising by the Vietnamese against the U.S. occupation. In March, Britain was still the United States' closest ally, and thousands of people basically put the U.S. embassy under siege there. And it was a very worrying time because this is our friend and they're trying to destroy the embassy and so on. So this was another indication that things were beginning to erupt. In April, this month, Martin Luther King was assassinated, and something like 125 American cities just erupted into riots and looting. And it took 70,000 National Guard to basically stop this uprising against this, what people called the execution of Martin Luther King. So this again was amazing. Following that, students at Columbia University occupied the university to try and stop Columbia from expanding into Harlem, which was seen as, it was in solidarity to stop the monster of Columbia buying up all the buildings and basically turning them over for profit. In Germany, one of the student leaders, a guy called Rudi Dutschke, got assassinated. He didn't get killed, but it led to thousands and thousands of students coming out and fighting with the police and going after, the right wing. It was shortly after that the Democrat Lyndon Johnson basically decided that because of the growth of anti-war sentiment, he was no longer going to be able to. He was an incumbent, obviously, but he wasn't going to try for another term as president. There was a new candidate called Gene McCarthy, if people are familiar with him, that won in a place called Wisconsin. So it kind of turned the tables. Some things are similar today. The Dodge Revolutionary Union movement was formed around this time in Detroit. Then in May, a student revolt in Paris led to a strike by 10 million workers in France. It was the biggest strike in history up until then. Workers occupied their factories. These are unbelievable scenes that really people felt came out of nowhere. There was also something called the Prague Spring, which was, there was a Stalinist regime in Czechoslovakia, and they were under a lot of pressure from below, and they came up with this idea of socialism with a human face. But this was because people were basically saying, we don't really have socialism here, we want change. So there was even struggles in places where there wasn't supposed to be any struggle at all because everybody was happy. And then in August, Russia invades Czechoslovakia. And then later in the year, thousands of people are trying to challenge the Russian occupation of Czechoslovakia. There was a lot going on this year. Then we had during the summer at the Democratic National Convention, there was, because the Democrats didn't want an anti-war candidate, Mayor Daley, his son now runs Chicago, basically battered and bloodied anti-war protesters, both the delegates and people who were protesting the convention, and these scenes were broadcast all over the world, and that there was a trial and so forth after it. But this was about dissent among people who actually supported the Democratic Party and wanted them to take an anti-war stand in the election. So there was a real, sense of concern even with the Democrats. In September, protesting students and workers were massacred in Mexico. Hundreds were killed. And this was again the time when, it was the revolt of the black athlete, when you had Tommy Smith and John Carlos do that really amazing and memorable Black Power salute during the American National Anthem. And again, millions of people were watching this all over the world and were totally inspired by it. And this had a huge impact on people who were beginning to fight back. And then the last couple of things that are kind of more, seem to stand out. There was a student revolt in Pakistan that led then to a more generalised uprising against the dictatorship. And then in Northern Ireland, where I'm from, it was the beginning of a civil rights movement that started based on how oppressed Catholics were treated in the north. But people basically got all their ideas from watching the black struggle in the United States. All their tactics were modelled on what came through television screens over the last 10 years. So just that, again, it just gives you the sense of the internationalism. And this then led to a full-on challenge, to the British rule and the loyalist state in Ireland, and what people call, the Troubles. So, that's just some of the events very, very quickly. And all of these events were, huge at the time and got a lot of attention. People drew all sorts of political conclusions from them, and they all built on each other as well. And then if you add this to, protests in Italy, in Spain, there was a strike by workers in Chile, and then again in Yugoslavia, there was protests took off there. There wasn't really anywhere in the world that wasn't touched by, the revolts of 1968. And they all interacted on each other and kind of fed off each other and became more radical as the year developed. So all over the world, all these struggles kind of took a qualitative leap forward. The anti-war struggle, the Black Power struggle, people really began to believe liberation was possible. And all sorts of liberation from many different things. Liberation from the boot of American imperialism, liberation from the monotony of work, the grinding day, that people thought, we can have different kinds of work lives. It doesn't have to be this boring 9-to-5 hateful process that's very alienating. Liberation from racial and sexual oppression. The women's liberation movement exploded in 68. The gay liberation movement exploded in 68. They named themselves after the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. Chicanos began to struggle in larger numbers. Native Americans started pushing harder for their rights in the United States. So everywhere, people began to fight for their liberation, and it was liberation from individual forms of oppression, but then it was also a sense that if we want individual liberation, there has to be collective liberation, because it's the whole system that holds us all down. So people went from fighting for their own specific form of liberation to saying it's the system that's the problem. And this again was the amazing generalization that started to develop in 1968. All of the oppressed groups started to fight back. There was, I think 1969 as well was the biggest labour upsurge in the United States since the end of the Second World War. So the year of revolt became, the year of revolutionary hope, because people started to think, it's not that people didn't think change was necessary, but now people started feeling change is actually possible. And this was the thing that was very, very different from what happened before. Because I think that, the vast majority of time we know we're fighting a good fight, but most people don't really believe that we're really going to have a fundamental change in society, and it's going to look we can actually change it to make it look the way that we would really want. So you have, I think it becomes a year where people develop optimism about the way that their lives can look and the way that the world can actually change. And that might be one of the biggest lessons of 1968, and it was because of all these different struggles. Large numbers of people began to generalise from their own struggles across borders, across continents, from east to west. And remember, the world was divided by the Iron Curtain during this period. Connections between war, sexual and racial oppression started to make sense to people, and people could see that the whole system was based on exploitation of the vast majority. And this became more and more common sense to larger and larger numbers of people. And again, going back to the Tariq Ali quote, to kind of say as well, we didn't really see this coming. But I think it is important to kind of like look at where it did come from, because we're kind of living through a period ourselves now that's been, there hasn't really been any big struggle since, 68 to 75. And then we've kind of lived now through a period of like getting crushed by neoliberalism. And it's like, lots of people, I'm sure, have questions about, will people ever fight back again? There was just something different about people back in 68, where they had solidarity, they liked each other. Now everybody's out, now everybody just cares about themselves and, hates everybody hates each other and so on and so forth. So I don't know, I wasn't around. Maybe you can tell us if people hated each other back, in 68, as much as they hate each other today, obviously. I'm sure they had some form of road rage back in 68. So, in a sense, we've had a long calm in America and around the world. So I think that this discussion is actually relevant, because one of the things, what I want to do now is kind of focus on where did this revolt come from, and then focus a bit more on some of the, if enough time, on some of the kind of more key struggles, and tell a bit about the story and how they developed. Because the way that, when the way the police think is, if there's anybody from the police here, they can maybe tell us if this is correct, but the way the police work is that when somebody goes into protest, they think, there's got to be a group of like demagogues behind this protest that are just kind of in a cultish way influencing people. But I think, 10 million workers on strike occupying factories in France is even, people can be Machiavellian, even student activists, but this was a big thing to pull off, through dope and whatever else people use to try and do that. And then there's a kind of like, and then some of the way it gets explained as well is that people will just say, well, it was moral outrage because Vietnam. And it was moral outrage about Vietnam, and moral outrage is actually a really important and good thing, because that's where people start, mostly in terms of like, I'm going to fight back because I'm pissed off and outraged about this. But then the thing that does is kind of narrows it down to kind of say, well, moral outrage comes and goes. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes people care, sometimes people don't. Bye, I'll see you later, take care, sure. And that, it's just kind of students that were pissed off at their parents or whatever, and they were the detonator, and, it's kind of, so, there's different kind of explanations that try to play down the significance of what happened in 68. But I think that the contradictions of global capitalism are the real explanation for what was going on, because, again, you had a world that was divided between East and West. In the East, people were told this is socialism, it's a worker's paradise. You really don't want to live in America because, it's all about capitalism and bosses making money. And then in the West, people were told this is as good as it can get. Capitalism is expanding forever. Your life is going to just get better and better and better. And that's why, and we had the whole Cold War hostility. And I think in reality, we can talk more about the West, but in the West we had McCarthyism, which was kind of, no democracy. And even though there was an economic boom, capitalism was going through its largest and biggest expansion ever, not everybody was benefiting, because you had Jim Crow in the American South. So you'd get this kind of bizarre situation where you've got democracy and then kind of feudal relations, and absolute racism throughout America. So there's all these intense contradictions that are developing. There's also a massive level of urbanization throughout the world, because with the expansion of capitalism, you have the growth of the working class, and the growth of all these profits were based on higher levels of exploitation and so on, especially in some parts of Southern Europe that were kind of considered advanced capitalism. So it wasn't all great for everybody. There was lots of contradictions. And one of the reasons why students were at the forefront and became kind of a detonator to some of these struggles was because capitalism, when it was expanding, needed more and more technology. So they expanded education so that students could basically manage the new factories that were getting built, or the computers and so on and so forth. So, around the world there was many, many more students. They were getting shoved into campuses. But people, working class and lower middle class students who were going to school, were kind of going to get their mind liberated and to get educated. But that wasn't really the education plans that the system had for them. It was more, they were going to become the managers of capitalism. So it was a kind of, instead of being a liberating student life, the way it had been for like rich people in the past, it became something that was the opposite. It was like all about, you know, no child left behind and passing your exam. And students really hated this because it was in total contradiction from what they were taught about democracy in the West, and this is, you know, freedom of expression, you know, what the American Revolution was for, and so on and so forth. So people in the early 60s, you know, in places like Berkeley, students started to say free speech. We want to disagree with the idea that this is a democratic society. And so that's why students played this kind of role. You know, students were to be the new assembly workers, not necessarily in a factory, but you know, in different kinds of factories, but they were basically to run the new technology that capitalism needed to exploit people. And that's why it's called the year of student revolt.